My wife and I, we make it a point to change our lighting. We make a point to go out and sit in the sun in our little cubicle. I mean, it could be 20 out and it'll be 80 inside that little pup, and you got to open it up if there's sunlight out. And just by doing that, I believe that we avoided, you know, a lot of bad issues. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it doesn't take much effort to get 15, 20 minutes of sunlight, even in a cold environment.
All right, Scott, I want to go to the question of melatonin. You said several times you are working with Ritter, who is the number one expert on melatonin in the world. I believe you are one of the people in the world that knows the most about melatonin.
Yeah.
And I would like to clarify, most people think that melatonin is created here in the pineal gland, and melatonin is associated in a knee-jerk reaction with nighttime and falling asleep. Some people even take melatonin supplements. But and you're going to tell us how melatonin is actually made down in the cells, and the production of melatonin starts right in the morning. So maybe you can tell us, about that.
Well, I'll tell you what I know. What I did is that we were looking at the optics of the body, and it became absolutely clear that there was a need for an antioxidant in the outer part of the skin because of the optics, how many photons were coming in. And there was also there'd been some work done by some people saying that basically that melatonin is produced in every cell. So I started looking around at ways we could actually see whether that was true. And so there was a paper by Thurn several years back where he was looking at melatonin. He hooked people up to a catheter, was constantly sampling at 15, 20-minute intervals, but at least sampling at better, shorter intervals. And he put the people on a treadmill. And this was 9 o'clock in the morning when melatonin should be being suppressed big time. So what happened is that within 10 minutes, the test subjects doubled their melatonin level and eventually went up and plateaued. They were doing intensive exercise on a stair stepper. And then it stayed all the way along. This is 9 o'clock in the morning. How is the pineal gland generating any of this stuff going on? And what it appears based on the work is that there's a very close connection between, this was measuring blood plasma, melatonin in the blood. There's a very close connection between the blood system and muscles. So what happens is that the muscles are generating huge amount of melatonin depending on how much hard you're exercising. And that as you proceed in that area, you figure out, or you come to the conclusion that the cells in the muscles are generating melatonin, and only when they get to the point that they have an excess, because remember, melatonin is a consumable. Melatonin is when it does its stuff, is an antioxidant. It then falls down to AFMK and AMF, all these other metabolites that are oxidized, and they are antioxidants as well. So one melatonin is the equivalent of 10 antioxidants like glutathione. And it also upregulates glutathione. It was pretty obvious that from the experiments that there's no way the pineal gland was generating sufficient amount. And if you look at the levels that were actually being generated, like 200 picograms per milliliter compared to 60 at nighttime or 100 at nighttime, then it was pretty clear that there was a secondary source of melatonin. And again, it's hard to measure only in transient response. I'm kind of a transient guy as far as how I look at things. But when you start having transient changes then you see these spikes in melatonin that can only be coming from the local cells area, from basically all our cells. And that seems to be jiving with all the sweat data we're getting now. And then there was a study where they went and looked at the relationship between melatonin and cortisol during exercise by zoo. So it's more and more data is coming out that's showing that melatonin, yes, it is produced in the pineal gland, but it's done that. You think about it just from a logic standpoint. If melatonin is being produced and other than ATP and all that is being produced in quantities during the day, and then you start going into the night and that cellular activity drops, then you need some kind of supplemental melatonin. The brain is still running at 80% of its essentially capacity, generating all kinds of reactive oxygen species. So the argument is that the pineal gland is there to supplement or to deal with the brain and provide excess into the blood so that any of those cells that are running a little bit low can kick and suck up a little bit of the extra melatonin to get it to do what it wants. I think that that'll become more and more clear as we do more and more of these sweat studies. Again, like I say, it's really hard because you really have to measure things. Almost things are happening. This is sweat I'm measuring. So in less than 10 minutes, an event like eating or whatever is changing those that sweat systemically. And which I think is absolutely fascinating how quickly everything is responding to these changes. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what.
No, it does. And I want to run a model by you, which I've heard used, a simplistic model that once again, we go down into the cells. We have the mitochondria, which is the so-called, the power plant of the cell. It generates, ATP via the electron transport chain. And as it does it, and depending on the jumps and the energy that it absorbs, we'll talk about that maybe too, it generates reactive oxygen species, ROS, and those have their benefits, but they are oxidants. And so melatonin is an antioxidant. So in a way, I've heard the analogy, and I want to see what you think about that, is you have the engine running, the engine is running, and as it runs, it gets hot. So in a car, you cool the engine. You cool it with liquids, you cool it with water. In our cells, in our body, you cool it with melatonin. Is this a good analogy?
I think so. I think that, you're basically, whether you call it, it's like the extra photons that we're talking about. It's like the oil going into the engine. It doesn't take much oil to make the engine run much more efficient. If it runs much more efficient, it doesn't generate as much reactive oxygen species. And that's where melatonin is a great player. And I think that you think about it just from a logical standpoint. You have some kind of an issue, whatever it is, somewhere on your body. If you're always depending on a systemic response to that, you're never going to get there. So locally, it's very clear that all we need to survive until the system, number one, if I do something on a systemic level, it may not be the right thing for that particular locale versus something for the general body. So it's more and more apparent the skin basically has all the different mechanisms, all the different pieces to even generate its own vitamin D if it needs it, because vitamin D is an antioxidant as well. So, there's all these different abilities that we've underestimated, I think, especially in the skin. So, I don't know, the idea that melatonin, we're seeing it in all the different locations. And if you try and do a transient response, it's very hard to believe that the pineal gland is being turned on in order to generate these huge amounts of, because we're talking about massive amounts of melatonin that's being generated, during the day when everything's supposed to be shut down. So
does it get triggered by the light of day? This generation of melatonin that's not from the pineal gland, or does it get triggered by activity? We get up, we start moving around.
I think probably a little bit of both. Bear in mind that there was a paper by Professor Light, Peter Light of all people, where he actually took and measured the cellular response on a single cell, the change in voltage potential. And he changed lighting, went through the spectrum of light, the visible spectrum, perfectly mapped out melanopsin as far as its response. These were in fat cells in the skin. And what his conclusion was is that 10% of all the fat cells in your skin contain melanopsin, which means I think probably predates the formation of eyes. Our skin was responding to sunlight because it needed to know. And then eventually we evolved to have eyes that could see, gave us an advantage in other things. But most of the melanopsin in the body is not in the retina. It's actually in the skin.
Which brings me to, we talked about you being in, New Jersey. And like they say on one of the TV shows that we may have seen late at night, winter is coming. Right? So winter is coming, and your skin has a lot of receptors for the spectrum of the sun. But you're saying, I'm sorry, it's 25 degrees outside. I'm not exposing my skin to the sun. I'm going out dressed. Now, you could argue the long wavelength of the infrared will penetrate through your clothing, deep into your body or through your clothing. So you might say, hey, I can go outside dressed nicely and be warm and yet still get at least the infrared component of the sunlight because it penetrates deep. True. But that's where maybe people use those panels. They say, I'm staying home in the warmth of my nice, cozy home, and I'm using an infrared and red panel. Maybe that's why the panels, maybe that's one way that they should be used, maybe.
I don't know. I don't like to poo-poo other people's approaches other than to say that I don't think the science is really there from the standpoint of we are never exposed to that kind of situation in nature.
In other words, the narrow band, the red at 650 exactly.
And the more you make that narrow, the narrower that spectrum is, the higher the peak for a given number of watts. And like I say, my big concern is I've seen people that burn themselves on some of those panels, and I'm not sure what it does to your eye. And we always have, like I say, you look at the panel this big, and then we've got one the size of a room, and then we're doing $200,000 or more for a table that puts it on, and you can get an effect. I can get an effect by hitting you with a stick. I just don't know if it's a good effect.
When Glenn Jeffries did his very famous experiment of people who ate a glucose-rich meal after being exposed to red light, I believe he did use a panel, didn't he?
Yeah, he used a 670 nanometer panel, and I think it was 670, and he had about 28 kilojoules. Now, bear in mind, sunlight is on the order of 1,300, or 30 megajoules per the day if you're outside. So, again, it's possible to alter, and it could be beneficial, the state of the body by that change. If you also notice in the data, though, by the time you get out to about 30 or 40 minutes, it's gone back down, after you. So there's a time constant transient response in that as well. I think, it's a great experiment. Especially, I think the CO2 was even better because it kind of gave you an idea that it was ATP that was It was the mitochondria that was doing it more than anything else. So,
Well, if going back to the Glenn Jeffries experiment, one would say just have your meal outside. But
yeah,
if it's the summertime, you could say it's even better. You can sit in the shade. It's okay. You can have your meal outside with no shirt on. Now you're doing even better. But if it's in the wintertime in Jersey and you're saying I'm getting dressed now, the infrared may penetrate your clothing, but the red at 670 may not.
yeah, no, I think that, and even then, the body's adapted. I would turn it around and I'd say that my point would be is that every cause of mortality increases in the winter in northern and southern latitudes. Every one of them. So to say that it's a good thing to be in the north is not always a good thing to say, because you can't get out, and I would argue that a lot of that is associated with the lack of solar exposure. And the same thing with flu season, the same thing with COVID. COVID was extremely seasonal when we first got into it, before they started generating all the vaccines. And if you look at it, there was a very interesting thing that I found when the data is that while there was a spike in the winter when we had the first, like most flu seasons, there was a spike. But then if you looked at it at the kind of those states down in the South, they had a summer spike in COVID deaths. And if you looked at the same place or the same time frame for Italy, they didn't. So if you think about it, air conditioning, 90% of the air conditioning in the world is in those southern states of the U.S. We essentially brought people indoors and saw a secondary spike in COVID deaths. So I guess I'd turn it around and say, my wife and I, we make it a point to change our lighting. We make a point to go out and sit in the sun in our little cubicle. I mean, it could be 20 out and it'll be 80 inside that little pup, and you got to open it up if there's sunlight out. And just by doing that, I believe that we avoided, a lot of bad issues. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it doesn't take much effort to get 15, 20 minutes of sunlight, even in a cold environment, so, and I think it's protective in a lot of ways, but that's
You
my,
just you just said something that to me was very meaningful. The general knowledge or opinion is the further south you go in the northern hemisphere, the further south you go towards the equator, the better, overall health you're going to experience in general, relative to yourself. The
yeah.
more south you go. But you raised a very important point. So just moving to Costa Rica is not enough. Did you move to Costa Rica and you are indoors all day with air conditioning? That's not the same.
No, it's not. And it's all comes back into this kind of, when I had the podcast with Cruz, I told him, I said, I think I said that I don't think you want everybody to move to Costa Rica. I don't think you'll be very happy, or El Salvador, wherever he's at. But, not everybody can move, and not everybody, especially within hospitals. I think that's one of the things that Roger is really focused in on. He really wants to bring this into hospitals, because if it's a positive, or even if you turn around and say the LEDs they've got, I think it's pretty easy to say that the LEDs they got in most hospitals are negative. And the fact that they then have the new design is all glass windows. Once knew a professor down in Princeton, and he happened to be in one of the buildings that it was all glass. And what did he do? He brought in a space heater, put underneath his desk, because he was always cold, because he was never getting the infrared component through those windows,
They were
even though they
blocking it.
were the
The windows
entire
were
wall
blocking it.
window.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's where you run into, there's multiple Titanics that are not very happy about what we're saying, you know?
You
Because,
know,
I
it's
mean, yeah, the glass manufacturers don't like what we're talking about. The LED manufacturers don't like what we're talking about. So it's kind of hard. Right.
it's almost excruciating to go back to the beginning of our conversation and think that 110 years ago, more than a century ago, hospitals had open windows and terraces, and you were wheeled out to spend a lot of time out in the sun. They called it, a sanatorium, maybe not even a hospital so much. And now here we are. It was 100 years ago that people knew that, and now they don't.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's what I found was, so when I did the models, we modeled the COVID half-life characteristics in darkness, because NIAID had done some original experiments, and they showed that the COVID in a droplet could essentially had a half-life of greater than an hour, maybe 2 hours. The minute you introduced the equivalent of sunlight into the environment, which DHS did, they dropped it down to 18 seconds for the half-life. So, and then we did a series of computational fluid dynamic models that showed that the transmissions, if you're 6 foot away from somebody, it took less than a second for that droplet to transfer to you. So if you think about all those things together, it becomes very clear that the effect of being outdoors is not just that we suppress the half-life of the virus, but it is also, and the other thing that we showed is that as I told you, I think earlier, that once the morning comes up, you generate a certain amount of hydrogen peroxide and ozone in the atmosphere. That's what occurs every day. And what we were able to show is that the transmission, or the flight, as the droplet goes through that environment, is essentially collecting molecules of hydrogen peroxide and ozone to the point that it deactivates in a matter of similar, like 18 seconds. But what it also showed is that the only way we could be getting the adults results we're getting from an epidemiological standpoint was that the body was enhanced in its ability to reject the virus by whatever means, whether breathing in the air or by forming a barrier to the virus. So it's very clear from the data, from the models, that we are essentially much more able to resist virus transfer or disease transfer if we're in sunlight, is what it looks like. So,
Well, talking about infrared light, we can spend an hour and a half just on the benefits that infrared light confers on our body, how we get infrared light, even just by being in a forest near the trees. They are basically getting it and expelling it, so that we get it just by being near the trees and the leaves and the greenery. Now, people are talking about infrared saunas as a good source of infrared light. Once again, I ask the question, isn't just being out in the sun a better way, or being in the forest with all the leaves and the trees, or the forest and the sun? Isn't that better than being in an infrared sauna?
I think saunas are really great. I mean, but I'd look at it two different ways. Sunlight is coming down, it's from a spectrum standpoint, sunlight is coming down into the longer wavelengths, about 6,000. As you move up in the temperature of the sauna, and it depends on what kind of sauna you've got. If you got one that has an infrared heat source, then it's bouncing around some longer wavelengths, but it's kind of like temperature of your body. You raise your temperature of your body, it changes the velocity of the molecules inside the skin and the body, makes them more likely to be able to fight off infection and do that kind of stuff. But in a sauna, you come up and you're getting into some of the bands that are pretty good. And so I don't know, but you're not going to live in a sauna. You're going to be in there for a while and it's going to have some benefit. It's kind of like the red light panels. It's going to have some benefit to you and all that kind of stuff. But it was probably a little bit more important that you spent more time outdoors getting the full spectrum and, getting the exercise associated with being outdoors. And so I think that one of the things that's kind of hard to do is quantify harm versus help, from the standpoint of how big a deal is it. And that's why I think it's so important what we're trying to do now with quantifying using electron volt measurements and see if we can actually put some kind of a relative comparison between how bad is it. The industry wants it to be that we add a little bit here and everybody's happy. I personally think that you need to actually eliminate LEDs from your environment because they are forcing a very high reactive oxygen state. They're constantly, every one of them is trying to pump cortisol. Pumping cortisol up in kids is a bad idea. It's one thing to do it with some exercise. It's like you can almost over-exercise. So, I guess that's where I think saunas are just another tool. It's like our
No, but
lightsabers. It's just a tool.
even if you talk about saunas, there are two camps even within the infrared sauna world. One swears by near infrared, one swears by far infrared. Some people try to have both, and then the infrared saunas don't get very hot. They get to 145, 150. Some people say, no, get the regular ones with the stones that are heated. There you can get to 200 and 210. So, what do you think of, for that?
Well, where are you getting the infrared? You're getting some infrared from the wood and all that other stuff, but the main source of the infrared is coming from the heater. How that is positioned is it's filling the area with infrared, or is it kind of hidden back underneath something else to where it's not, I kind of, Roger just put one in and I think he got a stone one, but, it's a great thing. It's just, it's kind of like all these other things though. You start using it, then you don't use it, you miss a week, then why not create an environment that's optimized for your own development that you don't have to think about so much?
Just visiting it one last time, it occurred to me just as you were saying it, I got a stone one too. So when the stones heat, well, what is heat? What is heat? Right there you get, the infrared radiation.
The stones, I think Roger measured 430 or something on his stones or something like that. You do the black body calculation, there's some level of infrared going out into those longer wavelengths. Yeah. But it also is kicking your sweat up like crazy, which is then changing the optics. One of the things that falls out that I think is going to be very interesting is that if you look at it from the standpoint of Marcus theory, it has what is called a reorganization energy. There are two things that work really well. Add a photon, increase the amount of humidity in the room, because that gives you, if your skin is well hydrated, it gives you more optimum driving characteristics for the mitochondria. So all these people that are in these rooms these winter are getting 20% humidity if they're lucky. And it's actually degrading if you believe the Marcus theory, that it's degrading the mitochondria efficiency slightly.
Now I want to visit something that, of course, you talk about a lot. We didn't really mention much. We mentioned it a little bit. Going to the short end of the spectrum, the higher, energy, UVB and UVC. And I'm sorry, UVA. UVC doesn't really hit us very much, although, from my understanding, there is some UVC reception inside the body. Is that true?
All I know is that what I would say is going on is that, as I said, the UVC is strongly absorbed in the body, and it is actually converted into hydrogen peroxide and ozone. And therefore, it is indirect. It's one of the things that's so beautiful about the design when you look at it. When light comes into the atmosphere, you see a blue sky. What is happening? That is called scatter, associated with a reduction in polarization. When photons are coming in, they're randomly polarized. When they hit a molecule in the atmosphere, they actually lose some of that polarization, and it scatters them, and it's very efficient, but it scatters it. And so the entire sky lights up as this beautiful blue. If you looked in the UV, it's lit up with UV. Now you think about that from the standpoint of delivery into the biosphere. The fact that we have this not just direct light coming in, but we have this scattered hemisphere of UV and blue, that is, it allows it to go down underneath the canopy. It's coming in from all angles, which makes it so it's a very, that's the first step that light gets, is to be distributed out almost evenly throughout in the blue and the UV based on Rayleigh scatter. So it's amazing optics from the standpoint of how it efficiently gets UV down into the places that all the different places, rather than just, because if it didn't have that effect, sunlight would come through highly collimated because of the geometry between the sun and the earth, and you would essentially just get shadows everywhere.
Well, actually, if I'm not mistaken, it was Bob Fosbury. Some people say if you are at a certain latitude, you're not going to get enough UVB in the wintertime between this month and that month to make vitamin D when it hits, the layers of your skin. And I believe it was Bob Fosbury who said, no, because of the scatter, you actually can. So the reason you're not making vitamin D in the winter is because you're covered. Of course, with the short wavelengths, they don't penetrate any clothing whatsoever. So I believe I heard him say, if you walk around nude in the wintertime, you'll actually make vitamin D.
Yeah, no, I mean, and the problem is, again, it's a matter of measurement, or how you measure the process. Most people will go and they'll say, look at the solar spectrum by measuring ASTM 1.5G. That ignores basically all the other stuff, the scatter that's around us, which is predominantly blue and UV. So, so you get this impression that from the data, how you measured it, that there's not very much UV in the winter. But the minute you take into account all the scatter over a whole hemisphere, then all of a sudden you see that there's a lot of UV still available.
Okay, so going back, UVB creates what we call vitamin D, and also 9 or 10 other things, I think, at the same time that are very beneficial to us. So
cortisol.
So UVB is very essential to our health, and UVA also create nitric oxide and other effects. Now, these two have been so thoroughly vilified. I listened to the podcast with you and the Australian doctor, this very nice guy. I forget his name now.
Are you talking about Max?
Yeah, Max, right. And in Australia, he is living the nightmare because he's trying to show people the benefits of these wavelengths. In Australia, you can't even talk to anyone. Even in my daily life, I talk to people about that stuff. They say, oh, come on, no way. It's going to ruin my skin. It's not going to be good for my skin. What do you say to all of that, knowing the very clear effects that UVB and UVA have when they interact with our skin layer?
Well, one of the things that I found, number one, you start out with, probably the worst thing you can do is put sunscreen on. From the standpoint of what it does is it actually does affect you don't burn, number one, but you start generating, what you do is you increase the amount of time people spend outside under sunlight without protection, because they are essentially lost the indicator. You get a sunburn because it's time to go in, stupid. That's what you're getting. And hopefully you get there before. My wife is a redhead in Kansas. What do you think is she she had to deal with? A lot. But it's not a matter of, I don't think it's a matter of using a bunch of sunscreen, because I did this paper for the cosmetic journal that they wanted me to write. And what it showed, we did the model of the skin. And what happens is that when you put sunscreen on, you increase the amount of time you spend outdoors. But what you also do is that all the sunscreens, in order to be politically correct, do have a cut in the UV. They don't affect your skin other than maybe a little golden tone or whatever. But so that means that you're getting more blue photons. Half the photons generated in the skin are in the visible, and half our reactive oxygen species are generated in the skin are in the visible, and half of them are in the UV. And so there's no doubt that these UV photons can generate melanoma if you're being irresponsible, not wearing a hat, doing those kinds of things, wearing light clothing. But if you do wear sunscreen and it makes you stay out more, that means you're getting a lot more absorption of blue. Well, if you do the model, you see that the blue mainly localizes in the basal layer of the skin, which then jacks up the basal cell carcinoma levels, which is well documented that men in particular are increasing levels of basal cell carcinoma. So it's, it's a tricky little game, because the right way to do it is exactly the way that the Aborigines do it. Put on blackface. They happen to have theirs naturally, but there was a company down in Australia that tried to sell toned, darker, and it was shut down big time because nobody wants to be walking around with blackface on. And yet we know that the Aborigines have no problem with melanoma. And, in fact, all the people that have higher melanin level. And we measured, what's amazing is that we measured, in fact, I think we're the only ones that ever did. We measured the difference in transmission through a person with white skin and a person with darker skin, very black skin. The gentleman I knew from Ghana. And there's a difference in the visible, but the minute we get up into the infrared, the difference vanishes, and we're all exactly the same. We're all black and white hair.
Yep.
So, it's almost like a political statement in some ways. Bottom line is that in that region, in the infrared, we're all behaving the same way, because the intent is to collect all those photons that we can in that region, because they're beneficial to the electron transport chain. And it's not just the electron transport chain. There's clear indication that the T cell velocities go up. There's all these different, the dynamics of the mitochondria in the cell actually increase, fusion and fission. So there's tons of different data out there, especially some of these things like NanoLive, where they do real-time measurements of living cells. And you can see, things accelerate. And if you put blue or cyan on there, the mitochondria slow down and eventually stop moving. So I think that the mentality should be thinking of the infrared as being essentially the protector of what we need in the visible and the UV. And it gets really, really a beautiful arrangement. If you look at the skin, the outer 50 microns is where most of the action occurs for UV, for making vitamin D or oxidizing cholesterol, and all the other the other steroids, hormones. But in that region, if you just look at the graph of melanin, you'll see that by the time you get up into that same region, melanin is absorbing like gangbusters. And you say that, but what you there's a paper where they showed that in the skin, and Yakumo showed in the skin that the melanin appeared to be oxidized. Well, there's like a 10-fold drop in the absorption at 280 nanometers or at 280 nanometers relative to unoxidized. So it appears that and that it's very hard to photo bleach melanin, but it's very easy to photochemically bleach melanin. So what appears to happen, and this is what Hudson showed, is the infrared is generating a level of reactive oxygen species, in particular hydrogen peroxide, by an increase by 6-fold. It photo bleaches since it's all the same skin. So in that same 50 microns, we're generating the hydrogen peroxide necessary to, and you can see that there's particularly people from Senegal. If you look at the pictures of them, you'll see that their skin looks kind of blue. And it appears that is essentially a photochemically bleached response that allows more of the photons to get into that upper 50 microns and then not be absorbed lower than. It gives them an advantage as far as I can tell. I mean, there's just so many beautiful things that happen optically. And I guess that's where I think, to your very first thing about what I bring to the table, is that the optics tends to show you a direction that the body has taken. And then you go to the biologists and the other people, the astronomers or, astrophysicists, and they take that and they turn it into something, they find the mechanism. But the body is amazingly adept at generating everything. And we're just now starting to look at the nanostructures that that's generated in the body and to localize various things. But, the optics almost always tells you something about what the body traded off to get there.
And once again, for the listeners who were cringing at you saying not to use sunscreen, I remind you, we've already visited it, earlier in this talk. We said, use nature's sunscreen, the shade, put a hat, be in the shade. And by the way, sunglasses. I mean, seemingly, we also absorb not just through the skin, but the retina absorbs a lot of so I mean, sunglasses also filter out only a partial range of the spectrum. Would you say that it's more beneficial to walk around with a hat to shade our eyes rather than with sunglasses?
I would say yes. And I totally agree with you. I would never tell anybody to do anything that puts them at danger, but be a little bit smarter about what is the solution. Wearing a hat, especially a straw hat. I did a spectrum on the straw hat. It's pretty amazing. The old straw hat is really pretty doggone good. It transmits a lot of infrared through it, especially with a slight open weave. And, it's just, it's amazing how sometimes the old is smarter than the new. But in general, it's kind of like everything is really being driven by comfort, not by science.
Well, Scott, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind we could talk here for about 7 or 8 more, hours. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time and being so generous with your knowledge. I very much hope that our viewers and listeners will benefit from it. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me today. Click the subscribe button for more video. Got a question or comment? I love questions and comments. Leave yours below. And here's another video you've got to see.